Good day, everyone. I hope you're all having a fantastic day. My name is Jaylee, and I am an Airbus A320 enthusiast or fan or whatever you want to call it. And welcome to the new series that I have created of me teaching you guys how to make your flight simulator experience much more realistic and more closer to real life procedures. Disclaimer, I am not a commercial airline pilot, but I am someone who read the Airbus A320 Flight Crew Operations Manual very much. I love reading it, and also someone who researched all that there is to research about aviation. So the point of this series is me sharing what I have learned over the years to you guys and how to make your overall flight simulator experience much more realistic. And for my very first video on this series, I would like to teach you guys how to calculate your top of descent. This is a very nice thing to learn simply because this is one of the mental math that pilots must need to learn. They must know this by heart and also being able to put it to use in case the situation requires you, right? So if you're a casual flight simmer, you don't really need to learn this stuff. But if you're someone who really wants to integrate realism into your everyday flights in the flight simulator, then learning this could be your game changer, right? So this is a pretty straightforward math. It doesn't require any high intellect of some sort. In the sense that it's not very hard to learn. You just need to memorize it, right? So here we go. So we are all aware that we do have a top of descent arrow on our navigation display that basically signifies where we must ideally begin our descent in order for us to reach or to descend down an altitude in the correct distance relative from the airport, right? But, everything is not always as it seems. So let's just say that what if the top of the set arrow doesn't show up on our navigation display? Do we just descend blindly into a certain altitude, or we can use the top of the descent formula in order for us to get a more or less estimate on how many miles do we actually need in order for us to descend safely into that certain altitude. It could be your initial approach fixed altitude or your final approach fixed altitude. It entirely depends on you. But using that formula, it does give you an estimate, or more or less the exact miles that you need in order for you to descend into that certain altitude. It's a more realistic option. So let us now proceed on how do we actually calculate the top of descent. So basically the formula for getting our top of descent is our current altitude multiplied by 3 divided by 1000, then add 10. It's basically a very straightforward formula. So let us now dig deeper on how to actually use this formula. So for this example, let's suppose that you are cruising at the altitude of flight level 320 or 32,000 feet. So first of all, we would need to substitute the given to our formula. So the formula says altitude multiplied by 3. So that would make 32,000 multiplied by 3. So let's perform. So 32,000 multiplied by 3 is 96,000. Then we would need to then divide it by 1,000. Why? Because we need to convert it into miles. If we don't divide it into 1,000, then we would need to have 96,000 miles of descent, which is nuts, right? It's not, you get the point. So you would need to divide it by 1,000. So 96,000 divided by 1,000 is 96. Then we would need to add 10. I will explain later on the video why we would need to add 10 to our formula. So adding 10, that would make the answer 106 nautical miles. Alright, so now we need 106 nautical miles in order for us to descend into the correct altitude relative from the airport. So why do we need to add 10? So the reason why we need to add 10 to our formula or the answer is because we need to give ourselves margin. Margin for what? Margin to be able to configure the aircraft down for landing. So for example, if you're flying an Airbus A320, Yeah, for configuring the aircraft for landing basically involves putting the gear down, putting the flaps out to either configuration 3 or config full, or flaps 4, you know, arming the speed brakes, completing the landing checklist, and that all takes time, right? So we need to have good margin in order to execute the landing checklist properly and to be able to configure the aircraft for landing. And it also basically aligns with the 3 to 1 rule in aviation. So what is the 3 to 1 rule? The 3 to 1 rule basically states that an aircraft must descend 1,000 feet per 3 nautical miles. So by therefore adding 10 to our formula and following the rule, we would basically get additional 3,000 feet as a margin in order for us to configure the aircraft for landing. And aside from that, 2,500 to 3,000 feet is also the standard initial approach fixed altitudes. So that would be the altitude if you are conducting, let's say for example, an ILS approach. Then 2,500 and up to 3,000 feet is typically the standard altitude on where you capture the glide slope and the localizer. So that is why we need to add 10 to our formula for the top of descent. That's all for now. I hope that you had learned something new. And also by learning this, I also hope that you are able to make your flight simulator experience much more realistic. So don't forget to follow and leave a like if you like the video. And stay tuned for further tutorials and tips on how to make your overall flight simulator experience more realistic.